I might sell out, but I'd sell for a lot higher price than that.
Bob, you're one of the most iconic politicians in Australia. And even for me growing up, and I think a lot of people in their 20s growing up, your face is so synonymous with our childhoods because whenever we turn on the TV, Bob Catter would be on there from 2010 to now. Are you surprised by how much like international coverage you get? For instance, when that May 1,000 Blossoms Bloom quote where you switch from the blossoms to the crocodiles, were you surprised when that ended up on Stephen Colbert and American television? How did you react to that?
Oh, when I was your age, I joined a group who threw eggs at the Beatles, and I was on the international press at 18 years of age. So, I suppose it comes pretty natural. You have an audience of young people, but it was very funny. And I mean, when you're young, it should be about fun and freedom.
Let 1,000 blossoms bloom. Holy moly, my name is Fergus Neal, and this is the Ferg Neal Show podcast. How are you guys doing? I've had a crazy day. Today's podcast was wild. Actually, I think wild would be an understatement. I didn't expect it to be as fruitful as it was. When I was thinking of Bob Catter, I thought that Bob might go, he did go on some tangents, which I think are enjoyable. And even if you don't like politics, you can almost look at it as a kind of performance art. How this podcast came about, we had Drew Pavlo on the podcast, who's a friend of mine, put me in contact with Bob. I was really nervous before doing this podcast. Who wouldn't be nervous of Bob Catter? We don't agree on everything. There's a lot that we don't agree with. He's at the tip of Queensland. I'm at the bottom tip of Victoria. It's interesting, he's 75, I'm 23. It's interesting, I think, that this conversation is happening. And it shows how great this country is, that these kind of conversations can happen from people who are polar opposites politically, but also geographically, also in terms of age. Listen to this. This is Bob questioning whether to the interview about 2 minutes before the interview. And you'll hear what he says, and then you'll hear his realization when he figures out that I'm already tuned into the stream.
Do we want to waste time on this? That's good.
He's saying hi, Ferg.
I'm tuned into him, right?
Yeah.
G'day, Bob. Can you hear me through that?
Yes, Ferg. How you going?
Usually you think that's an awkward moment, but I get it. I think this might be the first podcast Bob Catter has ever done. It's interesting that this is occurring. It feels like a dream. In the last 3 months, I've had death threats from criticizing the Chinese Communist Party, and I've interviewed Bob Catter. And I have to remind myself, I'm like, Ferg, you're a comedian, all right? Don't get too deep. Don't get abducted, Fergie Neal. Another bizarre moment, and we're going to get to the main content in a minute, because genuinely I think this is the most interesting conversation I've had potentially in my life. This is when I first say g'day to Bob Catter, and I say, Bob, how are you doing? Awesome, cool. How are you? Doing well?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
No, we get 2 boys at sea, and the government just decided to let them drown.
That's a good lesson for me. Don't laugh unless you know for a fact that it's going to be funny. I thought I'd ask Bob how he was doing. He'd say, I'm not doing good. You know how that's what Australians do. How you doing? Not bad. How you doing? Pretty shit. And you have a laugh. Turns out Bob was about to drop some real stuff straight away. And I was like, at this point, I was nervous. I'm like, have I annoyed Bob? Have I frustrated him? Have I pissed him off? Does he want to be here? What I didn't know is that this apprehension would be followed by one of the most fruitful conversations we've ever had on this podcast. I think in Australia right now, there's a paralysis of dialogue between conservatives and progressives, between old people and young people, between different minority groups and Anglo-Australians, between First Nations Australians and colonial Australians. There's a non-dialogue happening. Socrates talks about this. In order for democracies to prosper, there has to be a dialogic approach to conversation. I think conversations like this make that a reality. Guys, please share this on social media. Tweet about it, put in your Instagram story, share it on Facebook, tell a friend, tell your grandma. This conversation has something for everybody. I think I'll look back on this like in 10 years and go, wow, those ideas came into fruition. There's some crazy shit. There's some crazy shit in this podcast. When you hear the crazy shit that Bob says, just filter it through It's like, when you have a friend and he says some, like 75% of the stuff he says is really interesting and you're like, oh, we can do something with this, and 25% is crazy. Like, what are you talking about? Just take the good stuff, leave the bad stuff. What I love about Bob Katter is that he's passionate about this country. Like me, we both want Australia to be a great country and be great for all Australians, and I feel that in Bob. I don't necessarily agree with everything that he says, and he's had some problematic stuff in the past, but I think this is an awesome conversation. My name's Fergus Neal. Leave us a 5-star review. This is my interview with the great parliamentarian Bob Katter. Hey Bob, I really enjoyed your book, An Incredible Race of People. You place key moments in Australian history into context and explain what they mean for the people at the time and now. What do you think this critical 6-month period will teach Australians going forward?
I always ask people, I try not to preach, I try to listen. I say to people, so what's the first 3 things you'd do if you were the boss of Australia? And I would say about, I put it as high as 97% of the people will include in that answer the takeover of Australia by foreigners, specifically Chinese government, and the sending of our jobs and industries overseas. That book, An Incredible Race of People, which is easily the best history book you will ever read on Australia. I used to avoid squatting, but in my old age, I've been listening to Donald Trump too much. But there is no book that will tell you the story of your country as good as that book. And you might read Raphael Carbone's Eureka Stockade. He was the secretary at Eureka as well. And Robert Hughes's Fatal Shore. Jeffrey Blaney is a great historian, but I shouldn't say this, but he's very boring. He's very academic. And the stories don't live. The stories of people like Theodore and Blackjack McEwen and Les Thies and the Thies brothers, they're towering stories of truly great men. Ben Chifley. So back to your question. What is your question?
Yeah, so I was just asking, how do you think the last 6 months in terms of how Australia is going to get through the coronavirus, in terms like a post-COVID world, what do you think history will look back on and see how we dealt with it?
I spent a lot of time with a bloke that owns all the taxis in Townsville, and so he's got 60 or 70 drivers that pull in and have lunch, breakfast, dinner, have their cars refueled. He's pretty fair handle on what's going on. And he said the world will be profoundly changed by COVID. Now, one of the interesting things for me is, and one of the things that, if I was to sort of put in order of priority, what I'd do if I was the boss of Australia, encouraging and helping young Australians to have a family. It is almost impossible. If you work out how much it's going to cost to have a family, you won't have a family. You can't afford it. You'll go bankrupt.
Our mutual friend Drew Pavlo, he's done an amazing work bringing about the parliamentary inquiry alongside you, Bob. Why did you become involved in that case? And maybe you can talk about how you first met Drew Pavlo and why you wanted to get involved in universities.
Oh, I have a remarkable media staffer, and he zeroes in on issues that we should be picking up on. And he showed me this extraordinary 60 Minutes. And here is a thug, a bully, a crazy, an unprovoked assault and battery upon a person who was doing absolutely nothing wrong and nothing even provocative. And he's getting bashed up, and it's all on the television. Now, in 13 months, the police take no action. Since on the university campus, I was listening intently as to what action the university would take over this bashing on their campus. Well, they took action, yes. They took action against Pavlo, not against the thugs, the bashing thugs, suppressing free speech. The universities should be the nursery of free speech. I mean, Aristotle and Socrates, one or both of them was murdered because of comments they'd made, which were interpreted against the ruling junta in Greece, 300-400 years BC, before Christ. But that was the embryonic universities. I mean, universities are the nurseries of thought and ideas. And of their very nature, they must be given very wide-ranging freedoms. But in the university campus of U of Q, they give no freedoms at all. And they are run by money. They sold their souls. But when I saw that, I couldn't believe that, A, the police had carried out no action at all, and B, that the university had carried out an action against Pavlo. I mean, I was absolutely staggered by it. So when 60 Minutes found out I was going to move it in the Parliament, and it became public knowledge, and 3 Liberal members publicly said they were going to second the motion, the government got a bit scared and got off their tailbone and announced a wide-ranging inquiry. Now, Winston Churchill, a man of many great quotes, but one of them is, if it simply must not be done, then, of course, you hold a wide-ranging inquiry, and the wider the better, of course, because the wider the inquiry, the less likely it is to hit any targets. And, of course, the government immediately announced wide-ranging inquiry. And I said, well, it cuts no ice with me, mate. All my advice is that it goes to the Joint Standing Committee, which is a parliamentary committee. It's not answerable to the government. Not answerable to the government. That may well be puppets on a Chinese string. Communist government, not Chinese, communist dictatorship, a totalitarian dictatorship on a string. And the fact that they, when they were forced to, with 3 of their people, obviously going to jump ship, and the ALP not declaring its position, so there could be a humiliating defeat in the Parliament. Almost certainly all the crossbenchers would have been voting the way I was voting. But I don't know what transpired, but 2 days before I'm to put it into the Parliament with 3 Liberals backing it, suddenly Dutton announces that it's going to be referred to the Joint Parliamentary Committee on National Security, which is where we wanted to go in the first place. And there's some people in there. Chairman of that committee was a company commander of the SAS. I don't think he'll be mucking around. I don't think those SAS boys muck around. And the ALP bloke is a person of outstanding integrity, the deputy chairman of that committee. So if I was those totalitarian prostitutes who are on the Senate and the positions of control at the University of Queensland, I'd strongly recommend they say their prayers, but then probably most of them don't say prayers.
Yeah, Bob, your press conference with Drew Pavlo where Drew kept talking, you were telling him to shut up. Is that the first time Bobcat has ever had to pull someone up for being too passionate?
for a young bloke suddenly thrust into the national spotlight, he's done exceedingly well, And the persecution of Pavlo, the last thing that you arrogant prostitutes, and they're not really prostitutes because a prostitute only sells its body. They've sold their body and their soul to a totalitarian dictatorship, right? And people say, oh, but if you take the students away, what will happen to the university? Well, the same thing that's been happening to it for 130 years. It's only over the last 20 years that they've gone down this pathway. They've suddenly said, oh, we need an extra, 30% more pupils. We need more pupils. Why do you need more pupils? You've had less pupils for almost your entire history, and you've done a pretty good job, University of Queensland. But the one thing I loved, I wish 60 Minutes would have given me full run on it, but their logo is the Maltese cross. The Maltese cross is the cross of the Knights Templar, the crusading order of the Knights Templar. And 700 knights on Malta said, a Suleiman the Magnificent, the most powerful ruler in the Middle Ages, the Ottoman Sultan. Suleiman, it's all over a drover, mate. We're here in Malta, and I've gone off.
And I can still hear. Can you hear me,
I can't
Bob?
see you, though.
So Bob's desktop went black because he hadn't moved the mouse in 20 minutes. So I'll bring you back to the podcast now for a ripper historical anecdote. Good on you, Bobby.
Where was I? Yeah. The irony of this is that that's the Knights of St. John. The Knights. It was the Knights of St. John. It wasn't the Templars. It was the Knights of St. John. And there, was the Maltese cross, is called, and that's the symbol of the Queensland University. And the Battle of Malta, 740 knights stood up against an army of 240,000 of the greatest and finest troops the world had ever seen up till that stage. They had very effective mortar bombs and firearms, which were very rare in those days. And they threw 44,000 of those troops at the 700 knights. So they grabbed off the street about 7,000 Maltese, handed them a sword, and will you join us? And so 7,000 Maltese just dragged in off the streets, joined them. They had built magnificent, impregnable castles. And for 4 months, the battle for St. Elmo raged, leaving 6,500 Turks, Ottomans, dead around the castle. The castle walls had been reduced to rubble. And every morning they'd call for volunteers from the 600 knights that were at St. Angelo, and every morning the whole 600 had stepped forward, volunteering to go to certain death with 44,000 people surrounding a little tiny fortress manned by 2,000 or 3,000 people. And the fortress was completely destroyed. 6,000 or 7,000 Turkish soldiers lay dead around the walls. They had to use scaffolding to get over the dead bodies to get into the fort when they eventually took it. And every time they took a knight, they cut his head off and put it on a pike facing Fortress St. Angelo, the giant fortress. And then Mustafa, the commander, looked at St. Angelo and said, if the child cost us that much, what is the parent going to cost us? And the battle raged on for another 4 months, and eventually a ship arrived from Spain, the other great power of the Middle Ages. Eventually a ship arrived from Spain. And at that stage, 20,000 troops, reinforcements had come across from Turkey. But it was all over at Rove. and the Turkish incursions, which had taken 50,000 Christian slaves every year, the entire harem of about 400 concubines, the entire harem spoke Serb-Croat. They didn't speak Turkish. They were all Christian women. As was the same in Spain and Italy, all these countries that were conquered by the Muslim Islamic hordes. But it's a wonderful story about bravery and courage and men that believed in something. 3 times they breached the walls of Fortress St. Angelo, and Don John Parasot de Valette was the commander, and swinging his broadsword at 63 years of age, he personally led the attack that repulsed them from inside the walls of the fortress. And the Turks, who had surrounded and besieged Vienna, the capital of Europe, 3 times, and it was only a matter of time before, like, they took Constantinople again. They were no more, because 700 people stood up, sacrificed their lives, and 7,000 or 8,000 Maltese as well. What a storage of courage and belief and determination. But that's the symbol for the University of Queensland that represents, their leadership represent the exact opposite proposition. Cowards who would sell their grandmother into white slavery for 2 bob. They'd sell their grandmother into white slavery, and just so they can have more money and be bigger than the university next door. That's all. It's just about hubris. So you sell your country out for a little bit of hubris. Boy, oh boy.
Yeah.
I might sell out, but I'd sell for a lot higher price than that.
Bob, you're one of the most iconic politicians in Australia, and even for me growing up, and I think a lot of people in their 20s growing up, your face is so synonymous with our childhoods, because whenever we turn on the TV, Bob Catter would be on there from 2010 to now. Are you surprised by how much international coverage you get? For instance, when that "May 1,000 blossoms bloom" quote, where you switch from the blossoms to the crocodiles, were you surprised when that ended up on Stephen Colbert and American television? How did you react to that?
When I was your age, I joined a group who threw eggs at the Beatles, and I was on the international press at 18 years of age. I suppose it comes pretty naturally. You have an audience of young people, but it was very funny. And I mean, when you're young, it should be about fun and freedom. That's the other thing that gets me about this, where you'd have the most ridiculous ideas being proposed, as they have from time immemorial by young people at universities. And those ideas have never been suppressed. When I was at university, they did try and stop demonstrations. And even though I disagreed with the demonstrations, they were about Vietnam, and I probably was a bit pro-Vietnam, and I think history will vindicate my judgment there. Very scary times with the communists, very, very scary times. I mean, we now know that Mao Zedong murdered 48 million people. We now know that Stalin murdered 28 million people, and the dreadful things that were happening in the Ukraine. Well, one of the things setting all of this off is the situation with the Uyghurs, which is getting more and more publicity internationally. But there appears to be 1 million people missing from the population.
1.5 million, I think,
1.5 million missing from the population. Well, that was the story from the Ukraine. When the figures were eventually tallied up, 10 million people were missing. And he took all the livestock, he took all the grain, and and the people had to flee or starve to death. And well, these are not communists, the people in China. They're just another brutal totalitarian dictatorship, and they rise many, many times in history. And you do not placate them. Terrible message from the 1930s was you do not feed the crocodile. To quote Winston Churchill, you do not feed the crocodile. Each thinks that by feeding the crocodile, he will be the last to be eaten. But what he doesn't realize is, of course, that by feeding the crocodile, he absolutely ensures that in the end he will be eaten. And there was no feeding the crocodile when he took over Britain. He was shooting the crocodile.
But then, Bob, how do you think we interact with China? Because I know a lot of young people, and I've talked to Drew Pavlo about this, and even I found interviewing the leader of the Hong Kong protest movement, Drew Pavlo's had death threats. I had some death threats as soon as Joshua Wong retweeted my podcast. I think as soon as you criticize China, there's all this kind of backlash, and it almost seems like China becomes more steadfast in the atrocities they're committing. So how does Australia avoid conflict?
People that know a lot more about this than I do. I'm very new to this. I'm building dams and fighting against the cutting of our wages in the mines and the opening up of new mines and opportunities. I'm into building a nation, but I've been pulled sideways on this, and I come to it with a very high degree of ignorance. But I'm talking now to people that know, and they say, well, what do you do with any bully? I mean, I've had the honour of fighting every bully, every school I was ever in, and taken some very big hidings along the way. But I decided when I was at school that, you just have to fight a bully. The more you succumb to bullying, the worse the bully will get. You've got to stand up to him. And, I can't understand the Americans criticising Trump for being in bed with Russia. Nothing makes me sleep more peacefully at night than Trump being in bed with Russia. I got a very disturbing telephone call from a Chinese person who was on a prominent national media. I won't go any further than that because I don't want to get him in trouble. And he rang me about something which he wasn't the slightest bit interested in. He was silly enough to ask me 2 questions. All the rest of the questions were in-depth questions as to how far I was going to push it. And I got scared, but I was going to let him know that I was scared. Now, there are 2 possibilities here. One, he himself is scared what's going to happen to him because he may have said on his program a lot of things that he shouldn't have said. That's displeased the totalitarian dictatorship in China. It's not Chinese. I come from North Queensland. I would say 1 in 4 population of North Queensland has Chinese person somewhere in the family tree. My wife's best friend, or seems to be over at our house all the time, she's a Sing, which, is obviously Chinese. My 2 best mates on the planet, his wife, is a Shang. Obviously, Chinese somewhere in the family tree. One of my 4 daughters, her best friend is a Lee, L-E-E. I mean, somewhere in the family tree. Well, that's pretty typical, of the world in which I live. See, it's got nothing to do with China. In fact, by us standing up, and remember, what touched Pavlo off was the Uyghurs, and they felt, as every generation of young people, they should look for a cause. If they're decent young people, they should fight for a cause. Some of the causes can be a bit crazy, but this one, it's a cause worth fighting for. Your brother students over there are being persecuted and thrown in jail for expressing an opinion. Well, is that happening in Australia? Are they pulling the puppet strings here? Well, when you consider that they account and control, directly or indirectly, 60% of the Australian electricity supply. How much the water is owned by them, we don't know. But the biggest water licence in Australia is the Ord Stage 2 and Stage 3, which was given to China. The Cubby Station, which is the biggest working station with water rights, has the biggest water licence in Australia. It's owned by Chinese government instrumentality. So if they own the electricity, we don't know how much of the water supply they own, but it would seem to be very significant. What else do they own? I mean, most of our gas, it's reported in the media, I haven't had a chance to check it out, but we only export three things now. We export iron ore, coal and gas. We don't, there's nothing, I mean, agriculture's pretty small beer. And other things pretty small beer. So we're just a quarry, you know. But the gas, again, according to the media, now is overwhelmingly owned by corporations that are in turn owned by the Chinese government. So I just don't know how much of Australia is owned, and I don't know how many people are scared of losing their jobs or losing their income, or maybe worse. I mean, Pavlo had his life destroyed. At the present moment, he's had his life destroyed. Well, we'll see how it ends up. But this bloke scared the hell out of me, I can tell you.
Yeah. But one of my final question, I think this conversation is important largely because, I mean, I'm in Victoria, you're in Queensland. I feel like there's a growing consensus outside of Victoria that there's almost like this looking down on Victoria or this kind of disdain for Victoria in other parts of Australia. Do you see that happening? And if so, why do you think that's happening?
Yeah, I was told in the last state elections there that the Liberal leader was a spineless irrelevancy who didn't have a thought in his entire head. And the other bloke sounded like he was a man of with leadership qualities, speaking stridently and confidently. And at the start of the COVID thing, it struck me that he was speaking stridently and confidently. Now, when I see him on the television, I can't help but laugh. I mean, the bloke announced he's building, he was the first signatory of the Belt and Road with China, and it was going to bring great trade into Victoria. The only thing it brought into Victoria was COVID-19. Then he has enabled people to murder babies before they're born, and then he extended that in certain situations to murdering them after they're born. And it's quite extraordinary. He then proceeded to restrict freedoms on a massive scale. And then senior cabinet minister, one of these senior cabinet ministers, admitted that he'd been getting all these people to come to Australia from Turkey, but only on condition that they took out a membership in the ALP and voted the way he directed that they be voted. And he's the Premier's right-hand man. And the Premier tells us that he knew nothing about it. Well, I mean, either you're an imbecile, this couldn't be taking place, and you knew nothing about it, or alternatively, you're an outrageous liar. And now, I mean, when I used to watch him, he's a man of confidence and leadership. And now I watch him, all I can tell you is I burst out laughing. But, I'm sorry, but people outside Victoria say, what sort of people could have put someone like this in as the bloody Premier? I mean, the rest of Australia really has difficulty in digesting that a person of this nature could become a Premier. And, but sending the police in to a house and dragging a woman out who's pregnant in front of her family because she expressed an opinion that we should voice our voices on the way that COVID is being handled. She had in that release on her internet to make sure you keep social distancing and wear masks. Now, no person who honours freedom and has principles and integrity will do anything else except spit on that bloke. To do that and to be running the government.
Did he direct it though, or was it just the police, Bob?
It doesn't matter. There's been no public apology. There's been no explanation. There's been no sackings. Right? You are presiding over. You take responsibility for it. I was senior cabinet minister in a government. I was in cabinet minister for the best part of 10 years, and the government fell. I was number 2 in the government. Right? You are the minister. You take responsibility. And if someone has acted improperly, then I would come down on him like a ton of hot bricks. Punitive transfers, well, my modus operandi. Anyone that had the slightest inkling of paternalism, I threw out of the department. I had First Australians was my portfolio, and that was a magnificent success story. When I look back on it, I honour the people. I didn't do any of it. I just got a paper out recently saying I never did any. There's First Australians themselves that did it. But anyone that stood in their way, I acted with ruthless alacrity. Now this bloke, either he's absolutely hopeless incompetent, this could be taking place, he didn't know about it, or he's a flagrant liar over this Turkish connection with this senior minister and what was going on. 60 Minutes had a big beat up, said this will change politics in Australia forever. And I thought, yeah, yawn. But my curiosity got me a bit. And just out of curiosity, I flicked to the channel, and I just couldn't believe what I was watching on 60 Minutes. That was this issue, And but if we have leaders that are an absolute disgrace to us, like Lions, wasn't called the Liberal Party then, the United Party, Lions before the war. I mean, every one of we Australians should take the blame that an imbecilic, sycophantic little would-be POM could be the Prime Minister of Australia. Every one of us should hang our heads in shame. And while we're an incredible race of people, we realised the mistake we made in having Lions there. And we'd thrown Chifley and Theodore and Curtin out of Parliament, not just out of Cabinet or out of government. We threw them out of Parliament. But incredible race of people, we realised our mistakes, and we came back and we made, as 2 men, Theodore's too old, but the other 2, Prime Ministers of Australia. That's how much we realised our mistake. So the people of Victoria have made a mistake, and please God, they will realise the terrible mistake they've made and rectify it.
So do you think it matters that 70% of Victorians support, like 70% of Dan Andrews' constituents support his stage 4 lockdown because it is saving lives?
I have not bought into the COVID debate. I'm not a decision maker, and no one's going to take any notice of me. I have no particular skill or expertise in this area, and I've stayed out of it. And I have seen people passionately arguing both sides of the issue, and both sides I find extremely convincing, right? What I'm talking about is the complete undermining of the freedoms in Magna Carta. It is a constant warfare. And we, as the English-speaking race of people, we had a good habit in England of cutting the head off a king who still thought he had the power after Magna Carta. I mean, I think we cut 4 monarchs' heads off. So, you want to think that you've got absolute power and you're above the rest of us and you're not subject to the law, and that is your premier. That is your premier. You act that way, then you might have the numbers. You might even have the army. But in the end, we cut your head off. We, as English-speaking peoples, we can be very proud that we did that again and again and again. We said 2 to the valley and we left, as the Americans did. And stick it up your jumper. We're out of here, mate. You can have your absolute monarchy. But understand this. The king had the power to do anything up to Magna Carta, one of the great watersheds in human history. And at that point of time, the king lost that power. And he tries to get it back again and again and again. The crown incrementally creeps back to absolute power, where he can override the laws. If you violate my house, and the great Justice Coke, I think it was, he said, "Be it ever so humble, be the wind blow the door, backwards and forwards, and sear through broken windows, be it ever so humble, not the King of England himself can set foot upon the portals of my house without action of the law." Now, this bloke has got to himself those unlimited powers. His stormtroopers can go into your house on any pretext that he thinks up. He can violate your right. And in this case, all she did was express an opinion. That was all she did. And violated the most basic premise of freedom. Now, this bloke doesn't understand separation of powers. He doesn't understand Magna Carta. He doesn't understand that people have the power over him. He does not have the power over the people. His power comes from the people. All men born free and equal are endowed by their maker. And governments govern at the will of their people. The will of the people of Victoria would not agree that you can have your house broken into because you expressed an opinion on an internet.
Hey, Bob, sorry. Josh wants you to go to this next interview.
Awesome, cool. Bob, I'll let you go. Thank you so much for coming on the show, and I'll let you go to your next interview.
Very great honour to be on your program. We want to build Australia so that you're prosperous and free and beautiful future in a natural wonderland, which I enjoy every day of my life with our birds and 1,000 native trees in our little 10 acres. I don't own 250,000 acres anymore, but probably love my 10 acres more than my 250,000 acres that I own for most of my life. God bless all the listeners.
Thanks, Bob. May 1,000 blossoms bloom. See you soon, Bob. Bye, Bob. G'day, guys. Thank you so much for listening. This has been the Ferg Neil Show podcast. If you enjoyed it, please share it on social media. Drop us a 5-star review and tell a friend. My name's Fergus Neil, and may 1,000 blossoms bloom.